Over the years, tens of thousands of people have claimed that they've been abducted and experimented on by aliens. But a CIA whistleblower has come forward and stated that these abductions aren't being done by aliens. Believe it or not, this person says that they're being done by the government. It was in the late 50s, or maybe the early 60s. It happened so long ago that she couldn't really remember exactly when it had taken place. She was out to dinner with her husband and one of her husband's friends. Her husband worked a lot, and he didn't have a lot of friends. But this one was by far the most mysterious. This gentleman would show up at the oddest times, and her husband would often step aside with this gentleman, and they would have hush-hush conversations about seemingly very important matters. And tonight, the conversation seemed extremely odd. The two men were discussing flying saucers and secret bases hidden deep within the Brazilian mountains. This conversation was particularly odd because, well, her husband didn't believe in flying saucers. Many years later, this woman recalled this about the conversation.
My husband, was contacted by, I don't remember his name. I remember his face, but I don't remember his name. I think he was of German descent. He was a blonde man with light eyes. And in one of the meetings, we went to a restaurant, and they were talking. This man was intensively wanting to talk, and I recall him saying that there was a UFO going to the mountains in the Andes, like a station up there.
The woman's husband was a man named Bosco Nedelković, a genius with a super high IQ, a man who fluently spoke many languages, and one who could easily get his mind wrapped around the intricacies of convoluted, covert government projects. And the man that he was talking to? A CIA operative that just played the part of Nedelkovic's friend. At some point, prior to these dinner meetings, Nedelković was secretly recruited by the CIA to act as an interpreter in top-secret, highly sensitive meetings. His position was so secretive that not even his wife knew that he was working with the CIA. During his time in this position, he learned that the alien abduction phenomenon wasn't the result of newly arriving extraterrestrials from a distant, far-off world who had some strange desire to explore the anatomy of the human race, but was rather, get this, a government project that was codenamed Mirage, and it was created to study the effects of alien contact on individuals, and possibly even one day fool the public into believing that our planet was slowly being infiltrated by alien beings who had a nefarious plan for the future of the human race. In this video, we're going to examine this conspiracy theory and the possibility that the government, not extraterrestrials, are behind this alien abduction phenomenon. And we'll do this by first looking at two very well-documented alien encounters, the Boas case of 1957 and the Ernest Bryant case of 1965. With each of these accounts, we'll first share what the witness and the victim said happened. And then we'll share what this man, Bosco Nedelković, says really took place. And then we'll share the moment that this whistleblower decided to come forward and what he said about Project Mirage. And lastly, we'll tie everything up and we'll look at this case more objectively and we'll ask some deeper questions in the fact versus fiction section at the end of this video. Questions that we would very much like to get your thoughts on. So, this report begins in October of 1957. Tuesday, October 15th, 1957, was a particularly hot day in São Francisco de Sales, Brazil. So, a 23-year-old farmer named Antonio Vilas Boas rested during much of the day, doing work that wouldn't really cause him to sweat too much, and he waited until nightfall to plow his field. Much of the night was mundane as he drove his tractor back and forth, creating long rows of plowed dirt stretching from one end of the field to the other. Then, just about 1 a.m., as the tractor was making another long pass, a light appeared up in the night sky, off in the distance. And at first, Antonio barely paid any attention to it. It could have been just a passing plane. But every once in a while, as he was driving his tractor, he would glance up and watch the light as it traveled through the sky. And after a few minutes, he couldn't help but notice that this light looked as if it were getting closer, so he stopped his tractor and he took a better look. Sure enough, it was indeed moving his way. But still, it was in the distance. Perhaps it would just pass overhead. As Antonio watched it, at some point, it became frighteningly obvious that this light was not going to just pass overhead. It was intentionally coming straight toward Antonio, and this made him nervous. Who was in this craft, and why was it heading toward him? Before long, it was hovering just about 30 meters right above him. He described it like this.
I was now able to see it was a strange machine, rather rounded in shape and surrounded by little purplish lights. It was like a large and elongated egg with 3 metal spurs in front. On the upper part of the machine, there was something which was revolving at a great speed and also giving off a powerful fluorescent reddish light.
Suddenly, a bright light shot down all around him, startling him, and his first thought was to drive away. But if you've ever watched a tractor plow through a field, or if you've ever gotten behind one on the highway, you know that tractors just aren't that fast. They move painstakingly slowly, and there was no way that this tractor was going to outpace this craft. So Antonio dismissed the idea, but even as the thought was racing through his mind, he could see that this craft was still descending, and at some point, he was completely overcome with terror, and he jumped off of the tractor and he made a run for it. But before he got too far, he was caught by what he later referred to as non-human entities. He said that these strange beings spoke to one another in a language that resembled animal growls. They took him aboard the craft, and get this, they removed all of his clothing, and then they applied this strange thick gel all over his body. After that, he was taken into a room, and for some reason, they extracted blood from his chin. And then they left him there alone. And while they were walking out, a strange, noxious gas filled up the room, causing Antonio to get sick to his stomach. And then he said he vomited. Now, all of this is incredibly bizarre, but the story got really strange when Antonio described what happened next. While he was alone in this room, completely naked, check this out, a woman who was also naked and whom he described later as being not quite human entered the room.
She had thin, light blonde hair, parted in the middle, and large blue slanted eyes. Her high, white cheekbones narrowed to a tiny pointed chin. Her nose was straight and narrow, and her mouth was little more than a slit.
Antonio said that he was oddly, but definitely aroused by this woman. And the next thing that Antonio said happened is almost too outlandish to believe. As he was standing there, again, completely exposed, this attractive, naked, alien woman walked over to him and started rubbing herself up against Antonio. And before long, the two were engaged in a sexual act. When this sexual act was over, the woman gently pulled herself away, walked over to the exit, and then looked back. And while she was softly staring at Antonio, she pointed to her stomach, and then she pointed up into the night sky. And the message was clear. She was taking Antonio's baby with her to the stars. Shortly after this, she left the room, and his clothes were returned to him. He got dressed, and then he was escorted off of the ship. Then the craft lifted vertically into the air, and it disappeared into the night. This story is very strange, and it would probably have just been dismissed and forgotten if there hadn't been any proof that this ever took place. Oh, but there was proof. Feeling under the weather, Antonio went to see Dr. Olavo Fontes, and Dr. Fontes examined Antonio, and along with a scar on his chin where the aliens extracted blood, he also discovered that, check this out, Antonio had been exposed to a large dose of radiation, and he was suffering from mild radiation poisoning. Until the day that he died, Antonio swore that this event absolutely took place. In October of 1957, Bosco Nedelković, who was now working as an interpreter for the CIA, was sent to Rio de Janeiro, where he would become part of an 8-person team on board a very unique helicopter that he was told would be involved in new forms of, quote, psychological testing. However, since Nedelković was just an interpreter and there just in case his services were needed, he was told very little about this upcoming mission. The team consisted of 3 helicopter crewmen, an American naval officer, a Brazilian naval officer, Nedelković, and 2 other CIA operatives. Nedelković boarded the helicopter and it flew to a facility deep within the Brazilian mountains, where it was fitted with various devices and apparatuses. Then test flights were made. The helicopter returned. Some of these devices were removed and others were attached. This process of fitting the chopper with different contraptions and then taking it on test flights continued for a while. One of the things that they installed was a small room with chrome-like walls, and when one was inside this room, one could not tell that he or she was inside of a helicopter. It looked space-aged and alien in nature. Nedelković was not part of the testing process, so he waited. But then finally, on Tuesday, October 15th, the 8-member team, including Nedelković, boarded the chopper, and it flew off into the night. At first, it just seemed as if it were randomly flying through the sky, making several passes over various parts of the Rio Grande. But then, as the chopper was passing above São Francisco de Sales, someone said that one of the heat sensors had picked the signature up of a person in one of the fields below, and the helicopter immediately changed directions. It flew over the field where this man was, and it released a chemical that Nedelković later discovered was a powerful hallucinogen. A few minutes after the helicopter released this chemical, it made a slow descent, and it landed. The expectation was that the man on the tractor would be immobilized, but that wasn't the case. And before the helicopter even touched down, the man got off of the tractor and stumbled in a run for it. Nedelković and 2 other CIA agents were told to apprehend the man and bring him back to the chopper. So as soon as the chopper landed, the 3 men ran out through the back hatch and they chased this man across the field. And according to Nedelković, they caught up with him at the very far end of the field, and then they dragged him back to the helicopter. The man was groggy from this chemical, and he was stumbling, and he fell face forward, and he hit his chin on the helicopter ramp rung as he was boarding the chopper. This, of course, was Boas. Once he was inside the helicopter, Nedelković and the other two CIA operatives were told to set outside. And Nedelković said that he wasn't privy to whatever it was that took place while Boas was aboard the helicopter. But he did say that it took about 2 hours, and the night was clear and chilly. He said that it was a long wait. Finally, Boas, unconscious, was brought out, and he was laid beside the tractor. Then everyone got back into the helicopter, and the helicopter flew back to the base. These days, it seems like unidentified flying objects, or as they're now called, UAPs, are everywhere. They're all over the news, social media, and everywhere else. But the reality is that not very many people have actually seen one of these objects up close. What would you do if the next time you saw one of these unidentified flying crafts, it wasn't on your phone, on social media, or on the computer, or on the TV, but rather suddenly appearing right outside of your home? Well, that is exactly what happened to a man named Ernest Bryant, who lived in the city of Scorton in Devonshire, England. On Saturday, April 24th, 1965, right around 5:30 in the evening, while Ernest was outside working in his yard, he saw an extremely large flying saucer hovering very low over a field that was next to his house. Up until that very moment, Ernest had absolutely no interest in flying saucers or extraterrestrial beings. But this was something that he just could not ignore. So, bewildered, he made his way to the edge of the field, and he wanted to get a better look. And when he did, he saw 3 people dressed in what he later described as scuba diving suits, standing in front of this very large floating object. Their entire bodies, from head to toe, including their hands, were covered. Ernest didn't know what to do. He had never seen anything like this before, never been in this type of situation. He just stood there for a while, just pondering the situation. And then one of the people motioned for him to come closer. But Ernest hesitated. What does one do in this situation? But then they motioned to him again, and Ernest, very bravely, stepped out into the field and approached the 3 people. When he got right up to the trio, he could see that they weren't quite human. They had subtle but very different features than humans. When they removed their spherical helmets, it seemed as if they had a little difficulty breathing, and their foreheads looked as if they were just a bit too big. Then he noticed their hands. Instead of having 5 fingers, they only had 4. They were all missing their thumbs. They introduced themselves as, get this, extraterrestrial beings from the planet Venus. And then something nerve-wracking, but amazing, happened. They asked Ernest if he would like to come aboard and tour their ship. Well, who could pass up an opportunity like that? Ernest accepted, and a moment later, he was walking through their craft. He later said that it was divided into 3 sections, and as far as he could tell, none of the sections seemed to feature anything that even remotely resembled flight controls. He said that there were lounging areas, and there was something that resembled a television set, but absolutely no flight controls. Very sophisticated indeed. After walking him through the ship, the aliens escorted him off, and then get this. From about 10 meters away, he watched as the aliens first waved goodbye, and then the aliens and the craft just vanished into thin air. Well, shortly after this incident, Ernest couldn't help himself, and he shared the encounter with his wife. And she basically told him that he was crazy and that he shouldn't even think about such foolishness. And this whole incident might have just died right then and there if it hadn't been for the fact that the couple's children had overheard the conversation. And before long, all of their schoolmates knew about the incident, and then the people of Scorton as well. Rumors began to circulate. Maybe rather than aliens, the event had been provoked by an emergency landing of some sort by nothing less than Soviet spacecraft. Well, faced with the fact that just about everyone and his brother in the area knew of this outlandish extraterrestrial tale, Ernest decided that he would share his side of the story, and he wrote a letter to the local paper. This resulted in national awareness, and before long, Ernest's claim was investigated, and it was scrutinized. And there was speculation at one point that he was asked if he would be willing to undergo a lie detector session where truth-seeking drugs could be administered. Ernest agreed, and the matter was investigated behind closed doors. What exactly went on at this time behind closed doors is a mystery, but the investigation didn't go on very long. Shortly after this closed-door investigation began, on Saturday, June 24th, 1967, Ernest Bryant died of a fast-acting brain tumor. So far, we've reported that a man named Bosco Nedelković claimed that he had worked with the CIA as an interpreter in a program where psychological testing was being done on various individuals. This testing involved elaborate masquerading and strong hallucinogenic drugs, making people believe that they had been in contact with extraterrestrial beings. Nedelković said that he worked in this program from 1956 to 1963, and then he went on to work for the Department of Defense, where he prepared many briefings for several government agencies, and he was privy to highly classified information. The Ernest Bryant account, however, didn't take place until 1965, which was after Nedelković had left the program. So unlike with the Boas account, Nedelković wasn't directly involved, and he didn't say too much about the actual event. But his security clearance was high enough to allow him access to the information. Nedelković said that in January of 1969, the CIA reported the death of a man due to excessive experimentation. The event was referred to as the 1965 Devonshire episode. Later, Nedelković saw reports that also brought attention to this event, referring to the event then as the microwave incident. It placed the original account in the city of Scorton. Nedelković said that this classified information showed that after the initial alien encounter, CIA operatives posing as truth seekers asked Mr. Bryant if he would be willing to come back to London and undergo a lie detector session where truth-seeking drugs could be administered. This, of course, was a ruse. The CIA just wanted to see what would happen if the man were to be subjected to more psychological testing. So during this quote-unquote truth-seeking session, instead of being injected with truth-seeking drugs, he was given hallucinogenic drugs. And to amplify this effect, he was also subjected to high doses of microwave transmissions The hope, of course, was that by using this combination, when Mr. Bryant woke up, he would be even more convinced that he had indeed been visited by beings from the planet Venus. This account vividly stood out in Nedelkovic's mind because the report unequivocally stated that Mr. Bryant's death was a direct result of the government's psychological testing program. It was on Sunday, February 19th, 1978, when a self-proclaimed journalist with a skeptical slant on UFO reports named Rich Reynolds received a phone call from a mysterious individual claiming that he had worked with the CIA in a clandestine program that was designed to fool individuals and the public into believing that Earth was being visited by extraterrestrial beings who ultimately had nefarious plans for the human race. He said that this program, ran by the CIA, was codenamed Mirage. This individual was later identified as Bosco Nedelković. Nedelković was born in Belgrade, Serbia during the first half of the 20th century, and it became obvious at a very young age that he was highly intelligent, and he became an interpreter and a translator at the American Defense College, which educates future leaders of Latin American nations. During this phone call with Rich Reynolds, Nedelković claimed that in the 1950s and in the 1960s, several world governments worked with the CIA to deliberately fabricate UFO encounters, and they used mind-altering methods that had been developed in another CIA program called, wait for it, MK Ultra. Yes, the very same MK Ultra that was secretly ran by Sidney Gottlieb, a man who some have called the devil himself. MK Ultra's mission, of course, was to create solid brainwashing techniques that would be effective on anyone. The program is now well known, and it used high doses of mind-altering drugs and various forms of torture. Rich Reynolds listened carefully as the voice on the other end of the line shared his story. Project Mirage had access and utilized the very same methods that MK Ultra did. After a bit, the phone call finally came to an end, but it would continue just over a week later on Monday, February 27, 1978. During these two phone calls, Nedelković detailed the information about the two alien encounters that we shared in this report, the Boas account and the Ernest Bryant account. But those weren't the only cases that Nedelković mentioned. He said that, check this out, the government fabricated countless UFO encounters, and he mentioned many high-profile cases by name, including, get this, the Betty and Barney Hill account, the Pascagoula account, and others. Perhaps the scariest part is that, unlike with MK Ultra, this project was never exposed and is supposedly still taking place today. The CIA is fabricating alien abductions? Really? You know, I don't know what is scarier. The prospect that the governments of the world are fabricating extraterrestrial encounters, or that real live aliens from another world are actually here and experimenting on humans for some unknown reason. Both ideas are chilling to me. Today's report hinges almost entirely on Rich Reynolds' claim that he actually spoke with this Bosco Nedelković. So who is Rich Reynolds? Well, he's a journalist And he's the owner of the Inter-America Media Group. And over the years, he has made a lot of enemies because he doesn't just go along with the reported story. He has questioned everything from A to Z, referring to Bigfoot as a farce, and even debating ideas about God. He uses logic to carefully deconstruct different points of information and point out inconsistencies in different people's stories. So he has a solid history of being skeptical. And he said that at first, true to his nature, he was extremely skeptical of this man's Bosco Nedelkovic's story. But he said that the more that he listened, the more it just all started to make sense. All of the puzzle pieces seemed to fit. And according to Reynolds, these two phone calls weren't his only correspondence with Nedelković. He claims that they stayed in contact over the years, and Nedelkovic's story never changed. Although Rich Reynolds is the only one who can verify the details of the phone call conversation, there is other evidences that Nedelković just might have been really working for the CIA. Research assistant and author Tanner Boyle interviewed Nedelkovic's wife after Nedelković had passed from cancer in 1999. And although she could not verify that he did actually work for the CIA, she did say that shortly after his death, she was approached by several Brazilian journalists who said that they just knew that he was working for the CIA and they wanted her thoughts on the subject. But she could not give them a comment because he never shared his work with her while he was alive. She did tell Tanner Boyle that back in the 1950s and in the 1960s, several strange things did stand out to her. She said that although her husband did not believe in UFOs, she remembered that he seemed to pay a little more attention to the news reports about them than he probably should have. She also said that she remembered a mysterious man who her husband worked with. She said that she couldn't remember the man's name, but she said that she did remember that they would have strange conversations. And then there was something that really struck her oddly. She said that for some reason, he was constantly going to the Department of Defense, and sometimes he would be gone for weeks at a time. She said whenever that would happen, the State Department, not Nedelković, would call her and ask her how she was doing and how the kids were doing, telling her that her husband wanted to know. And she would respond with confusion and indignation, saying that, well, if her husband wanted to know, well, tell him to call himself. And then they would respond with, well, I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no phone connection where he is. She told Tanner Boyle that all of this made her think that her husband was indeed working with the CIA. On the other hand, like I said, this report hinges almost entirely on Rich Reynolds' statements that he spoke with Bosco Nedelković. Maybe he's just making the entire thing up for reasons we don't know yet. Or maybe he did speak with someone over the phone, and that person who called him wasn't Nedelković, and he just made everything up himself. There is evidence to suggest that this just might be the case. One of the dates that Nedelković gave about the Ernest Bryant account didn't match reality, but that could very well have easily been just a slip in conversation during a long phone call. Everyone makes mistakes like that. In the end, this is a deep report, and it begs the question, what if there are no actual aliens visiting Earth, and the whole world is just being duped by the government? Why are they doing this? And is there a deeper reason than just wanting to know how a person might react under such a stressful situation? We would very much like to know what you think about this. You know, today is April 4th, 2024, and if you're watching this video the week that we released it, well, then you have bragging rights to say that you were there when Rope released its very first video. We will be releasing a new report every other week, so subscribe and hit the bell if you would like to be notified. Our team currently consists of Amy and myself. Amy is a true brainiac with a passion for research and finding the truth and the details. She is an A player who has worked for over 30 years in the education industry and a person who has worked for some pretty heavy hitters. And you'll find out sooner or later that she is the absolute love of my life. I am blessed to have her. Our goal is to report on the events that society says just isn't possible. But I give you this promise. We will never make facts up. There may be different interpretations on what we report, but we will always report the facts. We'd love for you to stay with us and follow Amy and I on this journey as we report on the mysterious. And with that, well, I guess that ties it up for this report. Until next time, thank you for watching. Rope.